What happens when the earliest explorers, physicians, chemists, linguists, missionaries, anthropologists, and occultists begin studying the visionary plants and sacred fungi that transform consciousness and alter awareness? Between 1800 and 1950, scattered observations gradually became one of the most important foundations for understanding the spiritual history of humanity. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a remarkable convergence of exploration, chemistry, philology, archaeology, occultism, comparative religion, and anthropology. Between 1800 and 1950, entheogenic evidence transitioned from suppressed indigenous history to the birth of modern psychedelic science. The era was defined by the isolation of mescaline, the formation of the Native American Church, and early ethnobotanical expeditions. European explorers reached unknown cultures whose ceremonial spiritual systems preserved ancient relationships with visionary plants and sacred fungi. Chemists isolated new alkaloids, physicians documented extraordinary alterations of awareness, and botanists began classifying species with unprecedented precision. At the same time, scholars compared myths, rituals, initiation ceremonies, and sacred texts from civilizations separated by continents and centuries. 19th century Romantic and Victorian writers explored altered states using newly accessible substances like opium, hashish, and peyote, shifting focus away from Enlightenment rationality to inner psychology. These literary psychonauts used entheogens to induce visions, seeking transcendence and direct communion with the divine. Although the word entheogen would not be coined until decades later, many of the observations made during this period would eventually become essential to the field now known as entheogenic studies. Indigenous knowledge remained the indispensable source behind nearly every major discovery, even when early researchers failed to recognize its depth or sophistication. Religious studies likewise expanded beyond biblical scholarship into the comparative investigation of ancient mystery schools, shamanism, initiation, and ecstatic religion. Scientific language and spiritual interpretation often appeared to conflict, yet together they preserved invaluable records that otherwise might have disappeared forever. The story is packed with fascinating scattered observations in an age of exploration, in which ancient ceremonial knowledge slowly entered global awareness, carefully creating the foundation for modern psychedelic understanding. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K, or on Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. To understand the modern study of entheogens, we must first comprehend the centuries that documented them prior to anyone possessing contemporary psychedelic vocabulary. Our journey begins at the opening of the 19th century, where natural history, medicine, and comparative religion first began converging. By the beginning of the 19th century, European science had entered an era defined by systematic observation, taxonomy, chemistry, and global exploration. Yet much of humanity's ceremonial relationship with psychoactive organisms remained almost entirely unknown to academic institutions. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, Siberia, Africa, Oceania, and Asia had preserved sophisticated traditions involving visionary plants and fungi for generations, often embedding them within cosmology, healing, divination, initiation, ancestor veneration, and sacred law, rather than treating them as isolated substances. Between 1800 and 1840, peyote ceremonies continued to thrive and adapt in remote and less colonized areas, eventually spreading north into the plains of the United States in the decades following. Many explorers misunderstood what they had witnessed because their intellectual framework separated religion from pharmacology, whereas traditional societies frequently understood visionary plants as sacred intermediaries connecting the human world with divine intelligence. The influence of Carl Linnaeus continued to shape botanical classification, allowing newly encountered species to be cataloged according to increasingly standardized scientific methods that later ethnobotanists would build upon. The first half of the 19th century witnessed one of the greatest revolutions in pharmacology, as chemists learned not merely to describe medicinal plants, but to isolate many of their active constituents. In 1803, Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Ziertirner isolated morphine from opium, demonstrating that a plant's profound physiological effects could arise from a specific alkaloid rather than from the plant as an indivisible whole. Although morphine itself belongs more properly to the history of analgesia than visionary religion, Ziertirner's achievement transformed scientific methodology and established the conceptual framework through which later psychoactive compounds would be investigated. Throughout the following decades, chemistry increasingly complemented botany, allowing investigators to distinguish families of alkaloids, glycosides, resins, and volatile oils, while expanding laboratory techniques that would eventually become indispensable for entheogenic research. Romanticism simultaneously encouraged renewed fascination with mythology, symbolism, comparative folklore, and ancient wisdom spiritual systems, creating an intellectual atmosphere in which reports of visionary experience attracted growing curiosity rather than immediate dismissal. Thomas de Quincey's impact on entheogenic and drug history is monumental. He wrote the Western world's first modern drug memoir, titled Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, shifting societal perception of altered states of awareness from a purely clinical or taboo subject into an exploration of the unconscious mind and artistic transcendence. Before De Quincey, philosophers like Immanuel Kant viewed opium purely as a numbing medicine. De Quincey, however, celebrated the drug's psychoactive and visionary dimensions, famously writing about the apocalypse of the world within me. He documented his opium reveries as profound explorations of inner space, memory, and the palimpsest of the human mind. This mapped a conceptual bridge between chemical alteration and psychoanalysis long before Sigmund Freud. His glorification and harrowing truths about altered states set a blueprint for future generations of literary explorers. His work directly inspired Charles Baudelaire's Les Paradis Artificiels, or Artificial Paradises, and was a major touchstone for 20th century Beat Generation writers like William S. Burroughs. Early Oriental studies expanded European familiarity with Sanskrit literature, the Vedas, the Upanishads, Buddhist texts, and Persian religious writings, renewing interest in enigmatic sacramental substances such as soma and halma, whose botanicals' identities remained unresolved. Archaeological discoveries across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome inspired scholars to reconsider the ritual dimensions of ancient civilizations, including mysteries centered upon sacred beverages, initiatory symbolism, and ecstatic transformation. Comparative philology revealed unexpected relationships among Indo-European religious vocabularies, encouraging speculation that many cultures may have shared deep ritual structures inherited from common ancestral traditions. Although such theories often exceeded the available evidence, they established intellectual questions that would remain central throughout the following century. Missionaries, colonial administrators, physicians, and naturalists increasingly recorded indigenous ceremonial practices, sometimes condemning them, sometimes documenting them with remarkable precision, and sometimes unknowingly preserving irreplaceable ethnographic testimony. These observations, scattered across travel journals, botanical reports, medical publications, and government archives, would eventually become the foundational sources for later generations, seeking to reconstruct the global history of sacred intoxication. Here, we begin to see a hidden correspondence between science and spirituality. Altered states of awareness began creeping into the forefront of the public imagination through scientific exploration, indigenous anthropology, and personal accounts found in published literature. Throughout the 19th century, physicians increasingly distinguished poisonous plants from psychoactive ones, recognizing that certain plants and fungi produced extraordinary changes in consciousness without fitting conventional categories of disease or delirium. The global entheogenic landscape was already visible in outline. Peyote in northern Mexico, ayahuasca in the Amazon, morning glory in Mesoamerica, and older mushroom rites awaiting fuller ethnographic recognition. What unified these spiritual systems was not a single substance, but a shared cultural logic. Plants and fungi as mediators of healing, divination, revelation, and contact with invisible forces. That is why the early 19th century is so important in entheogenic history. It marks the moment when living sacramental systems began to enter global modern consciousness, setting up the scientific, spiritual, and esoteric developments that would later unfold in the century. Interest in Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushrooms expanded further as scholars examined reports from Siberian peoples, including the Koryak, Chukchi, Evenki, and related northern cultures, whose ceremonial use of the mushroom became one of the earliest extensively documented examples of a visionary sacrament outside the classical world. 19th century accounts of Amanita muscaria or fly agaric use in Siberia come largely from European explorers, physicians, and ethnographers who recorded the mushroom's central role in the shamanistic and daily lives of indigenous populations. Travelers described ritual specialists entering ecstatic states, communicating with spirits, divining hidden knowledge, healing illness, and guiding communal ceremonies through carefully structured use of the mushroom. Some accounts also recorded the remarkable recycling of muscimol through urine, a practice that astonished European readers because it illustrated sophisticated indigenous understanding of pharmacological effects developed through generations of observation. While many 19th century writers interpreted these ceremonies through colonial assumptions, their descriptions nevertheless preserved invaluable ethnographic details concerning ritual preparation, symbolism, costume, chanting, drumming, and cosmology. The image of the ecstatic Siberian shaman gradually entered European intellectual life, influencing emerging discussions concerning comparative religion, ecstatic consciousness, and the possible origins of priesthood itself. These early investigations demonstrated that visionary experience could occupy a respected religious function within coherent societies, rather than representing merely pathological behavior. Long before modern neuroscience or psychedelic science existed, careful observation had already begun revealing that altered states of awareness possessed cultural structure, ceremonial meaning, and enduring philosophical significance. In 1840, the French psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau consumed a heavy dose of hashish, concentrated cannabis, while traveling in the Middle East. Moreau used the experience as a psychiatric tool, believing that studying altered states of awareness could provide insight into mental illness. This culminated in his foundational 1845 book on the psychiatric study of hashish, laying a major stepping stone for psychoactive research in Western medicine. Chemists isolated strychnine and quinine. Caffeine was studied in greater detail. Nicotine received growing chemical attention, and numerous medicinal plants entered increasingly systematic investigation. While many of these substances were not visionary, they collectively established the scientific language necessary for later discoveries involving mescaline, psilocybin, lysergic acid derivatives, and countless other compounds. The laboratory did not replace indigenous knowledge, but rather provided one additional lens through which ancient ceremonial medicines could eventually be understood. At the same time, physicians became increasingly interested in the subjective dimensions of altered awareness, recording dreams, hallucinations, intoxication, anesthesia, delirium, and trance with greater descriptive precision than previous generations. These investigations gradually blurred the once rigid boundary separating medicine, psychology, philosophy, and religious experience. Consciousness was beginning to emerge as a legitimate object of scientific inquiry, even though no unified discipline yet existed to study it. As the 19th century progressed, plants once understood only through traditional knowledge would soon reveal their active compounds, opening an entirely new chapter in scientific history. In tandem, explorers, missionaries, diplomats, naturalists, and high society authors began encountering ceremonial spiritual systems and describing visionary experiences. By 1847, the first published image of peyote appeared in Curtis's Botanical magazine, a sign that the cactus had entered formal botanical visibility in Europe. That image matters culturally because visual publication is often the first step in turning a living indigenous sacrament into a scientific object. Around the same era, peyote was increasingly recognized as a plant with psychoactive properties, and the terminology of whiskey root and similar labels later reflected a growing colonial attempt to classify its effects in familiar terms. The broader cultural significance is that peyote's status was shifting. It remained a sacred sacrament among indigenous communities, but Western botany was now beginning to place it inside taxonomic systems that ignored its ceremonial world. This tension would eventually culminate in mescaline isolation near the end of the century, but this period is when the botanical and visual archive really starts to form. British Victorian botanist Richard Spruce made foundational contributions to entheogenic history by providing the first rigorous scientific documentation of Amazonian plant hallucinogens. His meticulous fieldwork preserved indigenous shamanistic traditions and supplied the vital specimens that fueled modern psychedelic research. In 1851, Spruce became the first Western scientist to identify Banisteriopsis caapi, which he described as Banisteria caapi. While traveling in the upper Rio Negro region of Brazil, he documented its use by local indigenous tribes. Also in 1851, Spruce encountered Guahibo Indians in the Orinoco region using a narcotic snuff. He documented its preparation from the seeds of the Anadenanthera peregrina tree. Spruce gathered crucial botanical specimens of the genus Virola, the red bark resins later discovered by ethnobotanists to be the source of the potent tryptamine-based hallucinogenic snuffs. Spruce's extensive field journals and plant collections sat archived until they were posthumously edited by Alfred Russel Wallace in 1908. These writings later served as the primary inspiration and roadmap for Harvard botanist Richard Evans Schultes, who is widely considered the father of modern ethnobotany. Through Schultes' expeditions and subsequent generations of researchers, Spruce's foundational work directly connected indigenous Amazonian plant wisdom to Western science, paving the way for the mid-20th century boom in psychedelic research and cultural exploration. During these same decades, explorers documented the ceremonial use of coca throughout the Andes, noting its central role in labor, pilgrimage, divination, reciprocity, and offerings to mountain spirits. European observers often misunderstood coca by evaluating it according to recreational intoxication, rather than recognizing its ceremonial, nutritional, and cosmological significance within Andean civilization. Reports likewise accumulated concerning tobacco, whose ritual importance extended far beyond smoking. Across numerous indigenous nations of North America and South America, tobacco functioned as prayer, covenant, offering, purification, diplomacy, healing, and communication with spiritual powers. Sacred pipes, smoke offerings, and carefully prescribed ceremonial protocols demonstrated that psychoactive plants could function as vehicles of relationship rather than mere instruments of intoxication. These observations challenge simplistic distinctions between religion and pharmacology, because the plants themselves were understood as participants within reciprocal relationships, linking humanity, nature, and the sacred. Although colonial narratives frequently minimize these meanings, careful readers increasingly recognized remarkable consistency across geographically distant spiritual systems. The 19th century witnessed prominent literary figures documenting the history of mind-altering substances. Major texts circulated around Europe and beyond, chronicling personal accounts of humanity's long relationship with psychoactive plants. French poet Charles Baudelaire fundamentally shifted the Western understanding of altered states, transforming drug use from a medical curiosity or medical malady into a philosophical and aesthetic pursuit. He moved the discourse of intoxication out of the apothecary and into the realm of the mind and human culture. His seminal 1860 book, Les Paradis Artificiels, or Artificial Paradises, serves as the cornerstone of this cultural shift. By detailing his experiences with hashish and opium, Originally inspired by the writings of Thomas de Quincey, Baudelaire established the West's modern psychonaut tradition. While indigenous cultures historically used entheogens for ritual or spiritual communion, Baudelaire treated them as tools for individual aesthetic exploration and psychological expansion. He argued that drugs provided an illusory, temporary elevation of the senses, allowing humans to imagine an ideal world. His writings on altered perception deeply influenced subsequent generations of cursed poets and the Symbolist movement, including figures like Arthur Rimbaud and Paul Verlaine. This laid the cultural groundwork linking bohemian art, creativity, and altered states of awareness. Mordecai Cubitt Cook, who lived 1825 to 1914, played a pioneering role in the history of entheogens by writing one of the first Western books dedicated to psychotropic drugs. His work introduced indigenous entheogenic practices to the Victorian public, and his detailed descriptions of mushroom-induced perceptual changes directly inspired iconic literary work. Published the same year as Baudelaire's work in 1860, Cook's book, The Seven Sisters of Sleep, offered an objective encyclopedic account of humanity's involvement with mind-altering plants. He chronicled the use of tobacco, opium, hashish, betel, coca, belladonna, and Amanita muscaria mushrooms. This work predated later specialized ethnobotanical studies and helped differentiate these substances from standard opiates. Through his books, including a plain and easy account of British fungi, Cook documented the entheogenic use of Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushrooms by the indigenous Koryak people. Cook popularized the term mukamor, bringing Siberian mushroom shamanism to Western awareness. Cook's writings documented the tendency of Amanita muscaria to disturb the scale of visual perception, a condition where the user perceives objects as dramatically shrinking or growing. This phenomenon, widely known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome, is heavily theorized to have inspired Lewis Carroll's inclusion of the size-altering mushroom into his 1865 story. As the century approached its final decades, anthropology began changing. Researchers increasingly recognized that understanding a ceremonial plant also required understanding the people, cosmology, and symbolic universe surrounding its use. Peyote, the small spineless cactus, known scientifically as Lophophora williamsii, had been employed ceremonially across northern Mexico and the American Southwest for many centuries before its systematic scientific study. Archaeological evidence already suggested considerable antiquity, while Spanish colonial records dating back to the 16th century described indigenous ceremonies involving the cactus, often condemning them as incompatible with Christianity. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, physicians, botanists, anthropologists, and ethnographers documented peyote ceremonies among the Huichol, Tarahumara, Cora, and numerous Plains tribes that would later contribute to the formation and expansion of the Native American Church. Researchers observed that peyote functioned not merely as an intoxicant, but as a sacrament embedded within prayer, healing, confession, moral discipline, communal solidarity, fasting, singing, drumming, visionary instruction, and ethical renewal. Yet, indigenous practitioners consistently emphasized that the sacrament derived its deepest meaning from ceremonial context, communal responsibility, and disciplined preparation, rather than from chemistry alone. This distinction between isolated compound and living tradition would remain one of the defining themes throughout the history of entheogenic research. The Native American Church coalesced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with organizational milestones around 1918 in Oklahoma and 1918 to 1920 among Southern Plains and Southwestern tribes, formalizing peyote's sacramental role in visionary, communal, ethical, and healing practices that fused indigenous shamanic spiritual systems with Christian frameworks. Around the turn of the century, peyote became central to the expanding ceremonial life of the Native American Church. Its cultural importance lay in how it supported moral reform, healing, prayer, and intertribal unity under conditions of intense colonial pressure. Peyote ceremonies were not simply drug use, they were disciplined spiritual systems that included all-night ritual, songs, symbolic cleansing, and leadership structures. A Huichol shaman once told a reporter who made the mistake of calling peyote a drug that aspirin was a drug, peyote was sacred. Peyotism has been much persecuted. Although peyote was banned by government agents in 1888 and later by 15 states, Congress, backed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the churches, and some Indian groups, resisted repeated attempts from 1916 to 1937 to have its use prohibited. Anthropologist James Mooney studied peyotism among Native American tribes, publishing The Mescal Plant and Ceremony in 1896, and continuing his fieldwork until it was banned in 1918. Mooney emphasized its fusion of indigenous ritual and Christian motifs, in contrast to missionary claims of superstition. German chemist Arthur Hefter isolated and identified mescaline from peyote in 1897. Building on earlier reports by explorers like Julius Caesar Ewing, and through self-experimentation and chemical study, Hefter established mescaline as the first naturally occurring psychedelic to be scientifically analyzed. Ernst Spath later accomplished the laboratory synthesis of mescaline in 1919, demonstrating that naturally occurring visionary compounds could also be produced through organic chemistry. Publishing their findings between 1895 and 1905, early psychologists Havelock Ellis and Weir Mitchell ingested mescaline, analyzing visions and comparing them to dreams or psychosis, setting the tone for decades of Eurocentric psychotomimetic framing, which defined entheogens primarily as tools to induce artificial insanity, rather than spiritual illumination. These milestones connected indigenous ceremonial knowledge with modern pharmacology, while simultaneously raising profound philosophical questions concerning whether spiritual experience could be investigated through laboratory science, without reducing its cultural and religious dimensions. Writers, psychologists, and physicians who experimented with mescaline during the early 20th century described intensified perception, geometric imagery, altered time, synesthesia, symbolic thinking, and experiences that challenged prevailing assumptions concerning consciousness itself. Around the same time, we meet other influential figures who moved the conversation beyond merely mescaline. Published in 1895, Edda Dorpa, or Aphrodite spelled backwards, also called The End of Earth, is a cult classic science fiction and alchemical allegory written by the Cincinnati pharmacist John Uri Lloyd. Its entheogenic legacy stems from its vivid descriptions of a subterranean journey, mind-altering substances, and metaphysical visions. In the narrative, the protagonist ingests a mysterious psychoactive liquid extracted from a gigantic subterranean mushroom. This ingestion induces astonishing multi-day dream sequences that mirror a Dante-esque underworld, featuring hallucinatory landscapes, disembodied gigantic hands, and shifting states of consciousness. Because Lloyd was a prominent botanical expert with a vast collection of medicinal plant literature, early readers and literary historians strongly suspected that he deliberately utilized his own stock of pharmacological knowledge to craft these highly vivid, psychedelic-like passages. Scholar Terence McKenna has repeatedly called Edda Dorpa one of the earliest psychedelic visionary novels published in the Western world. William James, who lived 1842 to 1910, is widely considered the foundational forefather of modern psychedelic philosophy. In 1902, William James documented experiments with nitrous oxide and other substances in his book The Varieties of Religious Experience to show altered states could produce mystical insight. By legitimizing drug-induced mystical states and treating subjective consciousness as an empirical frontier, he laid the philosophical and psychological groundwork for entheogenic research in the modern era. In the May 1915 issue of the Irish Ecclesiastical Record, a piece appeared written by A. Newman titled Monsieur Among the Mushrooms. This piece purports to be a non-fiction recollection of a person known to the author. Aside from the early date of its composition, what makes Monsieur Among the Mushrooms so interesting is that it purports to be a factual account of a group of people, informed as to the transformative power of the mushroom and united around a leader and a set of cult practices. It is difficult to believe that the author would have given such a central philosophical role to mushrooms had he not been aware of the visionary experience imparted by psilocybin-containing species. Among the most remarkable developments of the late 19th century was the growing documentation of ceremonial peyote, which gradually entered scientific literature with increasing clarity. As we turn to the early 20th century, occultists began incorporating visionary psychoactive plants into their spiritual practice. Fin de siècle, or end-of-the-century occultists, acted as a crucial bridge in entheogenic history. By reframing plant medicines as scientific tools to induce objective religious experiences, they moved substances like hashish and peyote away from mere sensory indulgence and into the realm of spiritual exploration. This shift laid the foundational philosophies for the mid-20th century psychedelic renaissance. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, occultists sought to prove that spiritual realms were real and experimentally verifiable, despite the rise of materialist science. Esoteric thinkers used entheogens as visionary microscopes to access immaterial reality. By systematically documenting these states, they positioned drug-induced ecstasy as a legitimate empirical method for studying consciousness. Perhaps the most prolific esoteric figure of the era, Aleister Crowley integrated entheogens directly into his occult framework. Crowley, who is most active from 1909 to 1923, translated and promoted texts like Charles Baudelaire's The Poem of Hashish, introducing the Western esoteric community to the philosophical implications of cannabis. He experimented extensively with plants like hashish, peyote, and other mind-altering spiritual sacraments, documenting how they dissolved ego and altered the set and setting of mystical rituals. Crowley bridged magic and psychology by interpreting his entheogenic visions not merely as encounters with literal spirits, but as psychological explorations of higher consciousness. Prior to Crowley, French occultists like Louis-Alphonse Coignet explored the use of visionary plants and mesmeric trances to systematically catalog spirit realms. These groups were among the first in modern Western history to argue that altered states of awareness could reliably yield consistent objective data about the afterlife and metaphysical planes. German pharmacologist Louis Levin, author of Fantastica, published in 1924 in German and 1931 in English, stands at the foundation of Western psychedelic research for his time, systematically documenting psychoactive plants like peyote, cannabis, Amanita muscaria, henbane, datura, and ayahuasca within medical pharmacology, framing these as substances that mediate visionary states rather than mere intoxication, a position that quietly opens space for later spiritual interpretation within psychology, religion, and anthropology. In December of 1934, Bill Wilson's white light experience was a sudden, blinding spiritual awakening at Towns Hospital in New York, occurring while he was undergoing a belladonna cure for alcoholism. This pivotal event ended his drinking permanently and later shaped the spiritual foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1936, Austrian scientific author Victor Recco published his book Magic Poisons, Inebriating and Narcotic Substances of the New World, covering secondhand observations on peyote, ololiuqui or morning glory seeds, ayahuasca, datura, and other drugs not mentioned in the earlier book Fantastica by Louis Levin. Also in 1936, the book Movers and Shakers by Mabel Dodge Luhan recounts her life among early 20th century avant-garde artists, radicals, and intellectuals in Greenwich Village. This book includes one of the first Western written accounts of a peyote experience. However, with increased public attention came increased scrutiny. In 1936, the film Reefer Madness premiered, and its screening fueled widespread anti-marijuana hysteria across American cities and rural areas throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, shaping public perception by linking cannabis and hallucinogen use to moral decay, crime, and insanity, and influencing early drug prohibition policies nationwide. The decade of the 1930s also marks a broader scientific shift in psychoactive chemistry. Indigenous practitioners consistently affirmed peyote and other spiritual sacraments as sacred mediums for divine communication and moral renewal, a view largely ignored as mescaline was mapped within a colonial scientific framework that separated chemistry from theology, a divide that shaped 20th-century psychedelic research. Researchers increasingly compared different plant-based compounds and tried to classify their effects as hallucinating, sedating, trance-inducing, or disorganizing. Mescaline's isolation marked the birth of psychedelic science well before LSD, and was later developed through Heinrich Kluver's analysis of vision form constants, Weston LaBarre's book The Peyote Cult in 1938, and the philosophical and clinical reframing of mescaline by Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in the decades to follow. Later still, scholars such as Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith situated peyote within a global and comparative understanding of sacrament and sacred consciousness. While psychoactive plants attracted growing public attention, another visionary spiritual system remained almost completely hidden from the outside world. Deep in southern Mexico, sacred mushrooms and other sacramental plants were quietly preserved in ceremonies largely unknown to modern scholarship. Scattered colonial references to sacred mushrooms survived in historical documents describing the Nahua word, Teonanacatl, often translated as flesh of the gods or divine mushroom. These early records fascinated historians because they suggested that visionary fungi had once occupied an important place within central Mexican ceremonial life, before colonial suppression forced many entheogenic systems into secrecy. Yet, for decades, few researchers succeeded in locating living ceremonial lineages that still maintain these practices. Isolated reports from Oaxaca and neighboring regions hinted that Mazatec, Mixtec, Chinantec, Zapotec, and related communities continued preserving nocturnal mushroom ceremonies conducted by experienced ritual specialists. Although the wider academic world remained largely unaware of these survivals before the 1950s, ethnographers and regional investigators slowly accumulated clues indicating that ancient practices had never completely disappeared. Between 1938 and 1939, Harvard botanist Richard Evans Schultes conducted extensive fieldwork in northeastern Oaxaca. He collected the first verifiable botanical specimens of the active mushrooms, later identified as Panaeolus and Psilocybe species, and published formal papers describing the sacred rites. The 1930s introduced another crucial development, the first clear scholarly notices of Salvia divinorum in Mazatec country. Jean B. Johnson recorded a yerba Maria used for divination in 1939, and later references in the 1940s described a leaf of prophecy known among Mazatec and neighboring peoples. These reports are culturally valuable because they capture a sacred plant at the moment it is still hidden from broad scientific recognition. Salvia was used for healing, spiritual diagnosis, and shamanic training, and its secrecy helped keep it outside the mainstream of botanical history for decades. The relevance of this is that entheogenic knowledge often survives through guarded local practice before it enters global literature. In that sense, Salvia's early record resembles other sacred plants whose meanings are only partially visible to outsiders. At the same time, anthropologists increasingly documented the ceremonial use of morning glory seeds containing ergoline alkaloids, known among Nahua communities as ololiuqui, and among certain Mixtec communities through closely related ritual traditions. Investigators recognized that these seeds functioned within divination, healing, diagnosis, lost object recovery, and communication with spiritual forces. Once again, the plants themselves could not be understood apart from prayer, ritual language, fasting, cosmology, and inherited ceremonial authority. These reports quietly demonstrated that Mesoamerica preserved multiple visionary spiritual systems, rather than a single sacramental cosmology. Although the broader significance of these discoveries would not become widely appreciated until after 1950, the documentary foundations had already been laid. Patient field observation, careful listening, and growing respect for indigenous expertise were gradually replacing earlier assumptions that such spiritual systems had vanished forever. As the world moved toward the middle of the 20th century, an extraordinary body of evidence had already accumulated. The next phase would bring these scattered observations together, transforming isolated reports into one of the most influential fields in the comparative study of religion and consciousness. The first half of the 20th century brought together discoveries from chemistry, anthropology, psychology, archaeology, botany, occultism, and the comparative study of religion in ways that few earlier scholars could have imagined. Anthropology increasingly emphasized extended fieldwork, careful documentation of language, ritual, and social organization, allowing researchers to understand sacred plants as elements within complete ceremonial systems rather than isolated curiosities. Franz Boas encouraged a more culturally grounded approach that challenged simplistic evolutionary theories, while many of his students demonstrated that every religious spiritual system must first be understood according to its own historical and cultural context. This methodological shift profoundly influenced future ethnobotanical research because it required investigators to listen more carefully to indigenous explanations instead of imposing external interpretations. At the same time, psychology expanded beyond the study of pathology into the investigation of dreams, symbolism, myth, and religious experience. William James had already argued that altered states of awareness deserved serious philosophical attention, observing that ordinary waking awareness represents only one form of consciousness among many possible modes of human experience. His insights resonated with later scholars who recognized striking parallels between mystical literature, visionary experience, contemplative practice, and ceremonial intoxication. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung likewise explored archetypes, symbols, alchemy, mythology, and comparative religion, suggesting that visionary imagery often expressed structures embedded deeply within the human psyche. Although Jung generally approached these subjects symbolically rather than pharmacologically, his work created conceptual bridges through which later investigators compared spontaneous mystical experience, dreams, visionary plants, and initiatory symbolism. Across several disciplines, consciousness had become a legitimate subject of rigorous inquiry. During these decades, numerous ceremonial spiritual systems continued to be documented across the globe. Researchers described ayahuasca among indigenous peoples of the western Amazon, where combinations of Banisteriopsis caapi and companion plants like Psychotria viridis served healing, divination, initiation, conflict resolution, hunting, cosmological instruction, and communication with spiritual beings. Although the chemistry of its constituent compounds had not yet been fully understood, investigators recognized the extraordinary sophistication involved in combining botanically distinct species into a single visionary preparation. Reports likewise accumulated concerning iboga within Bwiti traditions of Central Africa, where initiation centered upon visionary encounters, ancestral knowledge, ethical transformation, and communal identity. Siberian shamanic spiritual systems involving Amanita muscaria or fly agaric mushrooms continued attracting anthropological interest because they demonstrated that visionary fungi could function within highly structured religious systems, extending across generations. Ritual tobacco remained central throughout many indigenous spiritual systems of the Americas, while cannabis continued serving religious communities across South Asia, particularly within Shaiva ascetic traditions, where it functioned as one component of a broader discipline of devotion, renunciation, and meditation. Scholars increasingly recognized that sacred plants appeared within remarkably diverse religious frameworks, including shamanism, priesthood, healing lineages, mystery spiritual systems, pilgrimage, initiation, ancestor veneration, and temple ritual. Although each spiritual system remained culturally unique, many exhibited recurring themes involving purification, preparation, symbolic death, visionary encounter, moral instruction, sacred speech, music, fasting, and reintegration into communal life. These recurring structures encouraged comparative historians of religion to ask whether humanity possessed enduring ritual patterns that transcended geography, while remaining rooted in distinct cultural expressions. Such questions would eventually inspire later investigations into the relationship between esotericism, mysticism, and entheogenic practice. Perhaps the most important lesson emerging before 1950 is that no single discipline understood all of the answers or possessed the complete picture. Chemistry could identify the molecule, but ceremony revealed the meaning, and together, they illuminated a far more rich understanding of humanity. Anthropology was gradually evolving from a discipline largely dependent on travelers' accounts into one increasingly committed to sustained field observation. Although many researchers still worked within colonial institutions and often interpreted indigenous traditions through evolutionary theories now regarded as deeply flawed, their field notes preserved ceremonies, vocabularies, myths, ritual technologies, and botanical knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared under accelerating pressures of industrialization, missionary activity, and cultural suppression. Scholars such as Edward Burnett Tylor explored the origins of religion through concepts including animism, while James George Fraser assembled immense comparative collections of ritual, myth, sacrifice, fertility symbolism, and seasonal ceremonies in the Golden Bough. Neither proposed an entheogenic theory of religion, yet both contributed to conceptual frameworks that encourage scholars to compare religious structures across continents, rather than studying civilizations in isolation. Increasing attention was also directed toward initiation, death and rebirth symbolism, ecstatic transformation, sacred kingship, visionary dreams, possession, divination, pilgrimage, and ritual specialists, whose authority rested upon extraordinary states of consciousness. The emerging comparative study of religion therefore created intellectual space for later generations to ask whether visionary plants and fungi had participated in some of these traditions. Archaeology likewise continued uncovering temples, sanctuaries, ritual vessels, iconography, and inscriptions from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Mesoamerica, and the Near East, prompting renewed questions concerning sacred beverages, incense, fumigation, libation, purification, and sacramental consumption. Although direct chemical evidence remained unavailable, many researchers recognized that ancient ritual technologies deserved more careful investigation than earlier generations had allowed. The convergence of anthropology, archaeology, philology, and religious studies gradually revealed that altered states of awareness were neither accidental nor peripheral within human civilization. Instead, they frequently appeared at the very center of initiation, healing, cosmology, and spiritual authority. The most dramatic endpoint of the 1920 to 1949 period is LSD. In 1938, Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD-25 while studying ergot derivatives at Sandoz's laboratory in Switzerland, though its significance was not yet known. In April of 1943, Hofmann accidentally experienced the compound's effects and then intentionally tested it on himself days later in the famous Bicycle Day event. Hofmann described the onset as disorienting and terrifying, characterized by dizziness, paralysis, and an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures. He also noted kaleidoscopic visual distortions and an intense urge to laugh. This transformed entheogenic history because it created a synthetic visionary substance with effects reminiscent of sacred plants, but produced entirely in a laboratory. Culturally, LSD became a bridge between older entheogenic spiritual systems and modern psychopharmacology. It offered researchers a new instrument for studying consciousness, and it suggested to artists and philosophers that visionary experience could be chemically elicited without a plant source. By 1949, Sandoz's laboratory was beginning to distribute LSD under the name Delicid for psychiatric use, positioning it as a research tool for psychotherapy and the study of psychosis. Also in 1949, amateur mycologist R. Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina Pavlova Wasson began compiling early colonial records and corresponding with Schultes and Johnson. This initial research laid the groundwork for their well-known 1953 Mazatec expeditions. By 1950, the documentary record was sufficiently rich that the next generation of researchers would begin synthesizing chemistry anthropology, religious studies, and personal experience into an entirely new field of inquiry, met both by public support and public suspicion. By 1950, the puzzle pieces had been assembled even if no one yet saw the complete mosaic. Ancient spiritual systems, indigenous knowledge, laboratory chemistry, comparative mythology, visionary occultism, and religious scholarship were about to converge in unprecedented ways. Looking back across the century and a half preceding 1950, a remarkable chronology emerges. Early physicians demonstrated that visionary plants could be documented through empirical observation. Explorers revealed that indigenous societies possessed sophisticated ceremonial knowledge, preserved through living tradition rather than written scripture alone. Botanists classified thousands of species, while chemists gradually uncovered the active principles responsible for many medicinal and psychoactive effects. Anthropologists documented peyote, tobacco, coca, morning glory seeds, Siberian and Mesoamerican mushroom rites, Amazonian plant medicines, and numerous other ceremonial spiritual systems with increasing accuracy. Archaeologists and historians continued examining ancient temples, ritual vessels, mystery spiritual systems, sacred beverages, incense, and initiation rites, searching for clues that might illuminate forgotten dimensions of religious history. Psychology expanded the scientific investigation of consciousness, dreams, symbolism, and mystical experience, while comparative religion increasingly recognized that ecstasy, vision, transformation, and sacred encounter appeared throughout the world's spiritual systems. Occultism treated entheogens like hashish, opium, and solanaceous plants as scientific tools to induce altered states of awareness, with magicians and esotericists utilizing these substances to bypass subjective belief and seek direct experimental proof of the spirit realm and immaterial realities. None of these developments alone created the modern study of entheogens, yet together they established its indispensable foundations. Most importantly, this history repeatedly demonstrated that the deepest knowledge did not originate in laboratories or universities, but within indigenous cultures whose ceremonial lineages preserved complex relationships with visionary plants across countless generations. Modern scholarship gradually learned to recognize that these traditions represented sophisticated systems of philosophy, ecology, medicine, ethics, cosmology, and spiritual practice, deserving careful respect rather than dismissal. As history has taught us, the decades that followed would not replace these earlier discoveries, but rather reveal how foundational entheogenic experience had always been across global spiritual history. In our next video, join us as we enter the transformative decade of the 1950s, when long-preserved indigenous knowledge, advances in organic chemistry, and renewed scholarly curiosity converged with unprecedented force. We will explore the rediscovery of Mazatec mushroom ceremonies, the growing influence of ethnomycology, the expanding investigation of mescaline and lysergic compounds, and the individuals whose work forever changed the study of consciousness and comparative religion. Join us next time as we move from the historical foundations of entheogenic knowledge before the middle of the 20th century into the extraordinary discoveries and cultural transformations that unfolded during the 1950s. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants found throughout global spiritual history take us after the so-called nifty 50s? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.